Let's talk about some indirect questions in Latin here. So, the first question you might ask is, quite simply, what is an indirect question? So, let me tell you what an indirect question is, and we can stop there because this is a perfect example of what an indirect question is. Up top here we have a direct question. What is an indirect question? It's directly expecting an answer. But in this next question, you can see that this question, let me tell you what an indirect question is not something that's demanding any kind of answer, because the question is nested inside of this clause, and it's introduced by a verb of speaking. Let me tell you what an indirect question is. So here's the difference between direct questions that are in direct discourse and expect a direct answer, and indirect questions where they're introduced by one of these verbs of saying or asking or inquiring, followed by a question that isn't directly demanding an answer from the person hearing. So, indirect questions are going to be the third type of indirect statement that we've talked about so far. We have most commonly indirect discourse, and just as a quick reminder, that takes the accusative plus the infinitive. As an example, he said that I would leave, right? He said, just a nice main verb in Latin, we would just do dixit. He said that I would leave, may, right, would be our accusative object, and then to leave as our present active infinitive, discedere. Indirect commands. Once again, indirect commands are introduced by some kind of verb of commanding, plus an ut clause that takes the subjunctive, right? He commanded to me that to leave, right? And so we would do something like he commanded imperavit ut, right? And then I leave. Commanded is past, so discederem would have to be a nice imperfect subjunctive. And then indirect questions, which is the new one. To introduce an indirect question, we need some kind of verb of inquiring, asking, telling, right? Plus an interrogative, one of these question words, plus the subjunctive, right? So he asked why I had not left. So then in this one, we would once again have our nice verb of asking, rogavit, he asked why, kur is our nice question word, and then I hadn't left, we would have to put inside indirect discourse. No, sorry, we'd have to put inside indirect question and use our sequence of tenses to find the right tense to do that indirect question properly. Here, why I hadn't left would need to be a pluperfect subjunctive. Alright, and just a reminder again, indirect questions occur after verbs of asking, wondering, knowing, etc. You're really just looking for some kind of verb of asking, knowing, and this question word. So anytime you see a question word introduced by some kind of verb of inquiring or asking, that's going to be an indirect question. So once again, you run to a subjunctive, you're not sure what it is, look for that interrogative, look for an inquiring verb. Those are the things that are going to tell you how to identify it. As we've learned with every type of subjunctive so far in Latin, you need to know how negatives are introduced. Indirect questions are going to be like result clauses in that they just use the word known. So a good thing to remember, indirect questions, you just use known like result. Almost all our other forms of the subjunctive are going to use they. So good thing to remember. Alright, let's review sequence of tenses for a second, because once again, our lovely indirect questions are going to make them much harder. So if you'll remember sequence of tenses from cum clauses, in primary sequence, if we want to express something at the same time, we use the present subjunctive. If we want to express something in a subordinate time, we use the perfect subjunctive. In historic or secondary sequence, if we want to express something at the same time, we use the imperfect subjunctive, prior time, pluperfect subjunctive. This should all be review. It's stuff we've done before. The hard part becomes questions actually can introduce yet another level of time. Things can happen in the future. So we can talk through this in a sentence, right? If we have a simple question, I am in Rome, right? He asked whether I am in Rome. Nice present subjunctive here, right? We've got primary sequence. He asks. Whether's are introducing our question, I am in Rome, same time. Primary sequence, perfect subjunctive. He asked whether I was in Rome, Now we've moved back. We're in prior time. But notice we can also ask, he asks whether I will be in Rome. And suddenly Latin kind of breaks a little bit, because we've already talked about over and over again how we don't have a future subjunctive. But we're using a present subjunctive already to reflect same time. That's how the rules work. We're using a perfect subjunctive for prior time, so we need to make up a form that can reflect a future time. And so in order to do this, Latin makes up another periphrastic construction. Notice, I translated, he asks whether I will be in Rome, but really what Latin is going to do is it's going to say, he asks whether I am, sim, and then we'll use a future active participle to reflect the idea that we're going to do something even further in the future. So, he asks whether I will be in Rome is really, he asks whether I am, future active participle, about to be in Rome. And that's how Latin kind of gets around not having a future subjunctive, right? Whether I am about to be in Rome. Same thing can happen in historic. He asked whether I was in Rome. He asked whether I had been in Rome, pluperfect subjunctive. And then for the future, right, historic sequence, future time, he asked whether I was about to be in Rome, or yes, whether I would be in Rome. And then you're set. So let's look at just a couple examples here that can maybe help us out a little bit. So, here's our direct question. Who is present? And we can see how this sequence of tenses works as we walk through these different examples. I ask who is present, right? I ask, primary sequence, who, introducing our indirect question, odd seat, present, subjunctive, so it's just happening at the same time. I ask who is present, who's here. Next example, rogawi. Now instead of doing I ask in the present or I am asking, I asked in the past. I am asking in the past, I asked who adesset, was here. Once again, we're moving into secondary sequence, same time. I asked who was here. Now, if we put this in the future, who will be present, or who will be here, we can just keep implying he here for odd, because that's just saying next to whatever frame of reference we're trying to talk about. All right, who will be there, right? I ask, quis ad futurus sit, who is about to be present, is literally what it's saying. Who will be there? Who is about to be present. Sit ad futurus. So we move into secondary sequence, rogavi, quis ad futurus esset. I asked who was about to be present. I asked who would be present. Another example. Why will he come to Rome? Co Romon veniat. Why will he come to Rome? Rogo co Romon venturus sit. I'm asking why he is about to come to Rome, or I'm asking why he will come to Rome. Rogavi co Romon venturus esset. And once again, we moved into secondary sequence, so we're just using future active participle plus same time of the verb to be. So I asked why he was about to come to Rome, or I asked why he would come to Rome. I notice how Latin gets around everything by doing that. So hopefully that helps explain how indirect questions kind of work. The biggest thing you're just looking for is these interrogatives in the middle of a sentence with a verb of asking to introduce them. That's really going to clue you off as to what these are doing. So look for an interrogative without a question mark at the end of the sentence. That's how you see an indirect question. And once you've got that, just go back through your sequence of tenses. And they really aren't too hard. Remember, for this future time, we have to make up this really funky periphrastic construction, future active participle, plus a form of the verb to be. And if you can remember that, you'll be good.